The Arizona trunk murders, right. It's one of those cases that just grabs you and doesn't let go. Captivating, yeah, but also deeply, deeply unsettling.
Oh,
The
absolutely.
kind of story that sticks with you long after you've heard it. And we're diving back to, let me see, 1931 for this one. Picture this. A train journey, from the dry heat of Phoenix to that, like, bustling energy of Los Angeles, right?
Hmm.
In the baggage car, hidden amongst the ordinary luggage, are these two steamer trunks. But these trunks, they hold a secret, a gruesome one that would soon, well, capture the nation's attention. Two bodies. Anne Leroy and Sammy Samuelson brutally murdered, and the prime suspect, their close friend, Winnie Ruth Judd.
See, that's the thing about this case, right? Is that immediate question. Was she a calculating killer, or are we talking about a woman driven to some desperate act? It's a question that's really hard to shake.
Yeah, and the story just grabs you from the get-go, but it's amazing how quickly this case, it gripped the public imagination, didn't it?
It absolutely did. And it's not just the brutality, though that obviously played a part.
Mm.
But it's the contrast. I mean, you have this horrific crime, and then you have Winnie Ruth Judd herself.
Right, exactly. It's like, from what we read, she wasn't some hardened criminal. I mean, they describe her as breathtaking, someone with flawless style. There's even a line about her having a, quote, a veil of sadness. Like, come on, you start to picture a Hollywood starlet, not someone capable of,
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head there. It's that inability to reconcile her appearance,
Yeah.
right, with the sheer brutality of her alleged crimes. I think that's a big part of why this case still sticks with people. It makes us nervous. Like, can we trust what we see on the surface?
You're making me think about those old sayings, like, don't judge a book by its cover.
Right.
But it's hard, isn't it?
Human nature. We're wired for those shortcuts, those snap judgments.
Okay, so let's try to unpack some of this. We've got the victims, Anne and Sammy, close friends with Winnie Ruth Judd. But what do we actually know about the murders themselves, like the specifics?
Right. So the bottom line is both women were found shot to death. But the real smoking gun, so to speak, is in the forensic evidence. The autopsy report specifically mentions stippling. You familiar with that term?
Remind me.
So stippling, it's basically tiny burn marks from gunpowder.
Yeah.
And they found these marks on the victim's temples.
Okay.
What that tells us is we're talking about a muzzle-on-skin shot, meaning the gun, it was pressed directly against their skin when it was fired.
Whoa, that points to a very, I don't know, personal kind of act, doesn't it? And
See,
calculated.
there's no other way to put it. The stippling, the close range, it really does complicate the picture. Because remember, early on, a lot of the public actually had sympathy for Judd. They wanted to believe she acted in self-defense.
Yep.
But then this forensic evidence comes out, and suddenly you're looking at something much more deliberate, arguably much more chilling.
See, that's what gets me, because it seems almost impossible to reconcile, right? On the one hand, you have this premeditated act, and on the other hand, you have all these descriptions of Judd as this beautiful, almost tragic figure.
It's like a writer took two completely different stories and mashed them together.
Exactly. And yet, that's the thing, isn't it? That contrast, it's precisely what fueled the whole media frenzy. It was like, I don't know, something out of a Greek tragedy or something. This beautiful woman accused of this horrific, horrific
The
act.
newspapers, they ate it up. And it's important to remember the time period here, too, right? The 1930s. Massive social change, especially for women.
You got the flappers.
Exactly. The image of female empowerment was emerging, liberation. But on the flip side, you still had these incredibly rigid expectations about how, quote unquote, a proper woman should behave.
And Winnie Ruth Judd, right, with her beauty, her, I don't know, her apparent vulnerability, she was like a walking, talking challenge to those very expectations.
Oh, without a doubt.
So the question is, did she also shatter that image of innocence that the public, even the author of one of our sources, initially they wanted to believe it so badly?
Right.
But did she shatter that image? It really makes you think, doesn't it? About how easy it is for our perceptions to be swayed. You see someone like Winnie Ruth, this woman who seems to defy every stereotype of what a killer should be, and it's hard not to question everything.
Absolutely. It reminds me of something the author of this source said. They talked about how going into their research, they actually believed Judd's self-defense plea.
They did.
Yeah, they really bought into it. But then they started uncovering all this evidence that pointed to something much more calculated.
What kind of evidence are we talking about? Like, what changed their mind?
Well, a lot of it came down to archival stuff.
Yeah.
Letters, old newspaper clippings, even witness accounts that hadn't really been given much weight before,
Mm.
and none of it added up to this, I don't know, heat of the moment kind of thing.
Right. There was that whole business about the trunks, too, right? And the train travel. That just screams premeditation.
Exactly. That's exactly the kind of stuff the author uncovered. Evidence of planning, of attempts to conceal the crime. It's really hard to reconcile that with a simple act of self-defense.
It's like it makes you wonder what else we miss, Not just in this case, but in our own lives. We're so quick to judge based on what we see, on those first impressions, but what if we're wrong? What if there's this whole other side to the story we're completely missing?
And that right there is what makes this case so fascinating, even after all these years. It's a giant question mark about human nature. It's a reminder that things are rarely black and white.
We want easy answers. It's human nature.
Totally. We want the story to have a nice, neat ending. But the truth is, most of the time, the truth is somewhere in all that messy gray area.
And Winnie Ruth Judd, she embodies that, doesn't she? The beauty, the supposed vulnerability, it's all there. But, we can't forget there's another layer to all of this. What about her life after the trial? I mean, she spent years in an asylum, right? There were even a couple of escapes in there. And then, to top it all off, she gets a pardon.
It's wild, right? You couldn't write this stuff.
It really does make you question everything, Was it genuine remorse? Or was it all just a calculated move to get out of prison?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think that's what makes Winnie Ruth Judd such an enduring mystery. We may never really know the answer.
Or maybe, and this is just a thought, maybe it was both. Maybe it was a little bit of both.
It's definitely possible. And that just takes us right back to those shades of gray we were talking about, doesn't it?
It's almost like we're talking about two different people, right? You have the brutality of those murders, the careful way she tried to cover her tracks, and then, boom, this whole other chapter unfolds. A chapter seemingly filled with remorse, even compassion. It's hard to wrap your head around.
It really is, yeah. And it cuts right to the heart of some pretty big questions, doesn't it? Redemption. Transformation. Is it really possible for someone who's done something so awful to actually change? Or is it more like those two sides, the light and the shadow, are they just part of who we are, always?
That idea, the duality of human nature, it makes me think about something the author mentioned. They said that, getting inside the mind of a killer, really trying to understand Winnie Ruth Judd, it forced them to confront their own capacity for darkness.
It's unavoidable, isn't it? When you spend that much time with a case like this, it starts to seep in. I mean, the author even talked about being haunted by the victims, like in their dreams, as if those murders cast this long shadow, even decades later.
It's a terrifying thought, But at the same time, there's this pull to understand, right? That makes sense of how someone could do something so horrific.
It's the age-old struggle. We're repulsed by these acts, and yet we're drawn to them. We want to know the why. And I think that's exactly why this case, why Winnie Ruth Judd continues to fascinate us. It's not just about the murders, it's about us, about the dark potential that exists within us all.
We've been talking about this idea of easy answers, of wanting that nice, neat resolution. But the truth is, there are still so many unanswered questions. And maybe that's okay. Maybe sometimes the best we can do is sit with the uncertainty, embrace the complexity.
Absolutely. If this case teaches us anything, it's that the world, it's not black and white. There are shades of gray everywhere you look. And it's in those shades of gray, in that messy, complicated space, that the truth often lies.
Winnie Ruth Judd, a woman of beauty, of secrets, of unimaginable violence, her story is a stark reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we least expect, and the human heart. Well, that might be the greatest mystery of all.
I couldn't agree more.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Arizona trunk murders. It's a case that stays with you, that makes you question everything you thought you knew. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop searching for the truth, no matter how unsettling it might be.